Welcome to Smart Talk at the Henry George School of Social Science, where we speak with today's leading thinkers on critical challenges that our society is facing. My name is Aleksandr Gevorkyan. I'm a Henry George Chair in Economics at the Peter J. Tobin College of Business at St. John's University, and a trustee at the Henry George School of Social Science. And my guest today is Dr. Charles Clark, who is professor of economics at the Tobin College of Business at St. John's University. He is a senior fellow at Vincentian Center for Church and Society and expert for the Holy See Permanent Observer Mission at the United Nations. With over 150 publications, Dr. Clark lectures widely in the United States and Europe, and Dr. Clark has edited or served on editorial boards of numerous journals as well. He is the author of several books, most notably Economic Theory and Natural Philosophy, Pathways to Basic Income, co-author with John Healy, Basic Income, Economic Security for All Canadians, co-author with Sally Lerner and Robert Needham, and the Basic Income Guarantee, Ensuring Progress and Prosperity in the 21st Century, and many, many others. Journal publications and presentations on these challenging and important topics. So today we caught up with Dr. Clark to talk about his research and his work and view on the increasingly popular concept of basic income, especially now, which has been on the policymakers' agenda for a very long time. And Dr. Clark has dedicated much of his career to work on the topic. But recording this in April of 2020 in New York City, the topic has acquired a new significance in the background of the pandemic health crisis and the economic shutdown across the world. Before we turn to our questions with Dr. Clark, I would like to also welcome Ibrahim Adarmi, who is research director at the Henry George School for Social Science and is also a great motivator, right, inspiration behind some of the questions that we will be throwing at our speaker. Dr. Clark, welcome.
Glad to be here.
So, Dr. Clark, Charlie, if I may, we'll start with some of the direct questions. Maybe in few words, since we also need to be keeping our audience's attention on the main issue, but in few words, maybe you could just describe the core direction of your research.
Well, I went to the New School for Social Research and I did my dissertation under Robert Hallbreiner and thought that I would spend my career writing about Adam Smith and other dead white people. And then I just got asked, I was teaching in Ireland for a year and I was asked to do a study on how a basic income would influence the labor market in Ireland by a group that was pushing basic income. I had never even heard of a basic income at the time, and I had sent them a letter when I read a newspaper article about them saying, this sounds interesting, please send me your report. And then eventually they talked me into doing a labor market study, and then numerous others, which led to many of the books on basic income. I helped a group do the analysis for Canada, which was the basic economic security book. A couple of groups in the United States, I helped them out as well with the costing. And mostly I've been involved in the practical aspects of it in terms of how do you pay for it, how would you transition, questions like that. I've mostly stayed out of the philosophical debates on basic income, although occasionally I have been asked to speak on some things like what would Catholic social thought have to say. I've written a lot on Catholic social thought as well as what it has to say about economics.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, maybe we could, thank you for this. Maybe we could begin with a very simple question just to get definitions all in order. What is basic income?
Well, the proposal for a basic income is to guarantee people an income. Generally today it would be a monthly income or a weekly income, but something that would be a regular thing that would ideally be set at a level that would set them at above the poverty level for that country. There have been many different types of proposals, many much below what would be at the poverty level. But the idea is that it would give them security, that it would redistribute income to the groups that are being kept out for whatever reasons from the market economy or who cannot compete in the market economy. And it also allows for other benefits in terms of helping people transition in an economy that is rapidly transitioning.
So it sounds like a very strong idea, sort of in terms of supporting the idea of social fairness, right?
Well, the way I look at it, which is different from many, there are there are thousands of reasons people put forward to a basic income. It's sort of like the UN Declaration of Human Rights. They came to an agreement on the human rights, but no one agrees on why there are human rights. But it's a good part of our wealth comes from the fact that we just happen to live in the society that we live in. It has completely detached from any contribution we have connected to it. Now, a good part of our income is connected to how hard we work, how much education, and other factors. But a good part is just that we were born in late 20th century America, and we have a share of that. And everyone in the country has just, we inherit that, but it's not divided up at all equally. And part of this is just the intellectual capital and the benefits of the technology and the ideas that have been passed on from one generation to the next. And part of it is just the value of where we live, the mineral resources underneath us. And, so the idea is that you take part of the economy and divide that up equally. And then you let the market take care and other social policy take care of all the other things. Because if we take that percent, and I don't know what that percent is, but let's say it's 25%. If we take that 25% and let the market take care of that, well, then it's not going to any actual productivity factor. It's going to who can grab that portion. And so it will go to the powerful.
But then what about sort of the premise of the market economy of competitive forces and benefits accruing to most effective and efficient use of resources?
Yeah, so you still have the market taking care of, let's say, 75% of incomes either divided, or the market and social policy, because there are other factors. The people who are disabled might need more income support than what you would give them in a basic income because they have higher costs, health costs, things like that. But you still have sufficient market signals and social policy signals to try to encourage different types of behavior and all the reasons why we have economic policy. So I don't think it would mean that we'd have a much lower level of output than we currently have.
I see. Well, one question is that people often object, right? They'll bring up as an argument against the basic income idea is that it would put significant pressure on the government. Right? This is one of the obvious criticisms, but maybe there are others. And how would you respond to those?
Well, it was mentioned before, one of the interesting things about a basic income is that you get people like John Kenneth Galbraith and James Tobin, two economists who were giants when I was in graduate school, who were in favor of it. And then you have Milton Friedman and conservatives who thought it would be better to just give the poor money rather than set up the whole welfare state and regulate the poor. Now, the level of basic income that Galbraith would propose as opposed to Milton Friedman would be different, but both thought eventually you would have to have something like that. But the argument that society can't afford it is used for everything. And of course, society can afford it, just the redistribution of incomes. You have, if you look at the level of taxation, the high marginal tax rates that you would need to discourage people from going out and working, or discourage people from going out and investing, taking risks, innovating, and all the things that we want to encourage, they're very high. And I've never seen a basic income proposal that comes up with tax rates that would prevent that sort of those incentive effects.
Mm-hmm. Well, but related to sort of the criticism, I'm wondering, Ibrahim, if you could chime in. And I know you had a concern about whether a universal basic income, by the way, we need to clarify probably the differences, but let's just go with the basic income program, whether that would have a wealth tax. Is that right, Ibrahim? Maybe you could add more to the question.
Yes, that's exactly what I was going to ask Dr. Clark. By the way, welcome to Smart Talk, Dr. Clark.
Oh, thank you.
The question has been raised, and there is this idea of resorting to a wealth tax in order to fund the basic income. Now, the question that comes to mind is, how is that going to affect productivity or innovation? Because the more taxes you apply on something, the less you have of it. So how would you deal with that kind of criticism? And the other question that is somehow related to that is, companies are very good at avoiding taxes. So in case you impose a tax on, let's say, artificial intelligence and robots, there is a chance that some of them might try to evade the tax or even move out of the country. How would you deal with that?
Well, the issue of how you fund it, of course, is a big part of basic income, and a lot of the variety that you see is in different ways of funding it. We do have guaranteed incomes. Some are universal, some are less universal, but we have Social Security, which is a basic income of some sort. Requirement is a certain age and that you've paid in to the system to earn enough quarters. But the majority of adults in the United States who reach the age of 67 meet those requirements. So it's almost universal. State of Alaska has a basic income, and it's a basic income that's funded out of the oil revenues that the state of Alaska, once oil was discovered, they take half the money and it goes into this fund that pays for, it's called the permanent fund. And it is the most popular policy in the United States. I mean, it's not set at a level to bring everyone above the poverty level. It's based on the price of oil, so it's not going to be that high now for this year. But if all you have to do, unless they've changed it in the past few years, you had to live in the state for 11 months and then you qualified for it. And it's generally between $1,200 and $2,000 per person. So a family of 5 would get a nice amount of money. And the people I know that lived in Alaska who were college professors took that money and set it aside, and that was sort of their college fund for their children, things like that. But for most working people, it was very important for them. So in terms of a wealth tax, now, this is completely separate from basic income. I haven't seen many basic income proposals that suggest a wealth tax. It's not, well, if you're proposing something, it's better to rely on systems that you already have instead of, well, we're going to set up a completely new way of assessing wealth and taxing it. And that creates all sorts of complications, and you don't know how easy it's going to be. When Elizabeth Warren came out with her wealth tax, there were a few people on the left who criticized it and said that it would not be as easy to set up. I mean, I pay a wealth tax because I own a house on Long Island. It's, you know, property tax. So, but it's not adjusted based on my ownership of, you know, old books in economics, which I'm sure are incredibly valuable. But you know, I wouldn't propose it on a wealth tax, but I would be in favor of a wealth tax. Your basic proposition that if you tax it, you'll have less of it. I think one of the fundamental problems of the world economy is there's just too much wealth, and there isn't enough economic activity to support that wealth. And during the Great Depression, we got rid of a lot of the excess fake wealth based on speculation. But during the Great Recession, we didn't. We should have let a lot of that artificially blown up wealth disappear, like Goldman Sachs and company lose a lot, and then we'd have a better balance between the amount of wealth and the amount of output that has to pay that wealth. But that's completely separate from a basic income. But generally, a basic income, I think, should be funded at the broadest possible level, so it's a secure set of things that goes to serve the purpose.
Since we're conducting this in Henry George School of Social Science, the natural question is to connect the question about funding a basic income type program with the proposal that Henry George is kind of most known for, the land value tax. Right? I don't know, Ibrahim, if you want to also add to this question.
Yes, Henry George was in favor of basic income. He didn't call it so, he called it the citizen dividend. And he saw it as one of those ways he could use the land value tax to pay for. So, but the Georgist approach to the question is a little bit different from what you hear from mainstream economics, because they believe you cannot implement basic income without fundamentally reforming the tax system that we have currently. Now, the reason for that is the land value tax not only is important in terms of collecting revenues, but it's also essential in terms of dealing with inequality. So if you were, for example, to fund the basic income using taxes, and assuming those taxes are not collected from rent, what's gonna happen is more people will receive basic income, and most likely more people would be using some of that money to spend on rent, which will translate into rising demand for housing. And of course, the consequence would be those who own the land and who own properties will tend to benefit disproportionately. And prices, of course, is gonna be going up. And that's why the Georges think that a land value tax is probably a better way to fund the basic income. Because if you do it using the land value tax, you will also be able to control somehow housing price inflation. Housing will become probably more affordable, and the income that you are paying to people will probably go a long way. Now, if you don't do it that way, you get inflation, and you end up facing a situation whereby the basic income will have to be adjusted as housing prices increase. So that the Georges believes that is going to create a political problem for government, because more people will rise up against the idea of basic income.
So this is interesting, but Dr. Clark just mentioned how to make a basic income program be more effective, you should rely on the existing tax infrastructure. Did I understand this correctly? Not invent something new.
Yes, that's a very good point that you are making. And I agree totally what he says. It's easier to build from what we know instead of just bringing two big radical reforms at the same time. You know?
Because also Dr. Clark pointed out the problem with too much wealth. So
yes, but again, what I want to add was Alaska has something that Dr. Clark just mentioned. And what you have in Alaska is exactly what Henry George would call a land value tax somehow, because land in George's definition is not just the piece of real estate where you build your house. It also covers everything that nature provides, everything that is in the planet except human beings and the stuff that they make. So oil is one of them. Alaska provides a very good template. Now let's look at other sources where we could probably collect the rent.
So several ideas. Charlie, how would you respond to all these?
Well, I mean, most of my work has been to come up with how would it affect the distribution of income, aggregate demand, various economic effects, and then to propose different funding sources. I mean, these are really political decisions. And so I mean, I think the idea of a guaranteed income should be kept by itself, debated, decided, and then go on to, well, if it's worth doing, then how are we going to pay for it, and get into all those issues. Because what often happens with the basic income, particularly now that it's become very popular, is that everything else has tied itself to a basic income. And so we want a basic income, and then what I'm really interested is in doing X, Y, and Z. And then the discussion is just really all over the place, because the X, Y, and Z's are not going to be compatible with other people who are proposing a basic income, but they want it funded through, pollution tax or a carbon tax, or I knew a guy who wanted to do it through an email tax, which I was in favor of, because that meant I would get less email. If you taxed it, I'd get less crap sent to me on the internet. But, so I think the basic idea of how do we provide economic security for everybody, and the benefits of that in an economy that is particularly transitioning in a way where work is becoming more of a challenge, since we are becoming more and more replaceable by machines. That is, I think, the important issue around basic income. How you fund everything that government does is another very important issue, and one that requires significant reform and new thinking. Since so much of the wealth is completely avoids any taxation. I mean, a lot of my work has been on the Irish economy, and in many ways, Ireland is a huge tax haven where Apple pays 2% profit tax instead of paying the tax that they would normally pay as a profitable corporation in all the countries that they operate in. But they've managed to come up with a way to book all their profits through an office in Dublin and avoid paying taxes around the world. And they're getting caught and fined and other things for that. But the general problem of those who have income and control the world's wealth have so many avenues for avoiding taxes, that the issue of rethinking taxation and how we collect the money that society needs, and not just the money that it needs to pay for a basic income, because a government with a sovereign currency can pay for anything that's being sold. The issue is you have to absorb spending out. If you're adding $2 trillion in spending to the economy and do nothing else, then you'll start causing inflation. So you would have to, just like Social Security doesn't have to tax people to pay for Social Security, it has to tax it so that the people who are working aren't trying to buy the same goods as the senior citizens that we're giving money to will want to buy. So I think you can look at them both as separate issues, because they both have to be addressed. When I was working on the issue of basic income in Ireland, which I helped write part of the Irish government's green paper on basic income, the big thing in poverty research and social welfare research was tax and benefit integration. And how do you take both into account so that you don't have benefits that cause disincentives or taxations that cause disincentives. To give you an example, I did a study for a group, a basic income proposal for a group in England. And one of the things that we found out is that the taxation system in England at the time, and this is the late 90s, early 2000s, was such that if your income was at 12,000 British pounds, and then it went up to 14,000, that whole time period, your net income actually went down, because you lost benefits at a faster rate than you gained in income. And you really had to get to like 14,500 before your net income was higher. So you had all these different, what they call poverty traps, built in, because the taxation system and the benefit system each were working on basically different tracks, and the taxation system is often much more punitive towards the poor than the benefits system, particularly in Europe. So that was a big issue back then. Now it's not such an issue because the financial crisis, now with the pandemic, but much more of the growth in basic income as a policy has been in the developing countries. If you spend any time at the United Nations, you hear all this attention for the past 10, 15 years on using cash transfer systems as an important way of lifting people out of poverty. And the basic income policies in Brazil and Mexico were very effective in dramatically reducing poverty in the areas that they put it in. They weren't, the Mexican one wasn't based on individuals, it was based on families. And there were some conditions. Children had to get checkups at doctors and they had to attend schools. So it wasn't anything burdensome. In fact, it was things you want to encourage. But the growth in basic income in the developing world and the implementation is much more advanced now than it is in the developed world, in the rich countries.
Yeah, I just want to add to this and then come back to what you mentioned about your work with Ireland. But on the developing countries, my area, sort of geographic research areas, transition economies, I've done work mostly there. That's the former socialist countries of Eastern Europe, Central Eastern Europe, and former Soviet Union. And the emphasis on call it different names, basic income or some type of social guarantees remains still to be very strong. And different countries, of course, they're different size in terms of their economies. Most of them are small, but they rely on a combination of resources. They may undercut certain funding in maybe defense or education, actually, and then direct some of that extra funding towards the payment of pensions or families with more than 2 kids, for example. So in a way to also stimulate demographic growth, because in the 90s, a lot of them lost up to 20-30% of their population. But the larger countries rely, in the similar cases, Brazil, on the surplus revenues from exports of natural resources. So and obviously in the years before the 90s, there were all sorts of guarantees built in, but that was more of a political decision. So I would agree with you that this ultimately comes to being that it's solving an economic problem, but it isn't a political question.
Yeah. But one of the things you have to watch out for, and particularly with programs like the Alaska Permanent Fund, is that the idea that a basic income can be free, that we have this other source that, we don't have to really, it's not everyone contributing and everyone benefiting. It's just this newfound oil, which of course makes exploiting the oil as much as possible a goal of public policy, because everyone's getting a check out of that when we should probably be spending our time investing in ways that are not generating energy without oil. And so you could easily have set up a system that this is like a lot of local governments will do this, but we'll have casinos, and the casinos will be free money for the city, so we can do things with this new free money. And what have we done? We've not, besides encouraging gambling and other things, casinos tend to ruin neighborhoods. And just go to Atlantic City to see what happens when your future is bet on casinos. Whereas what you're doing is you're telling the taxpayer, hey, we're going to have this new benefit we're going to give everyone, but you're not going to have to pay for it. We're going to get this alternative. We'll use exports or something like that. And following my hero, Adam Smith, I think everyone should contribute so that it's seen as we're all sharing part of the economic pie, based on we're all in this together, and we want no one to fall below a certain minimum level, and then we can fight over the other 8 slices.
it sounds like what you're describing for this program to be effective. It's a combination of sort of the direction, sort of who are the receivers of benefit, monetary benefit, but also a combination of choosing the right sources for funding. And I really am encouraged by the statement that you made that it could be a free resource. It could be right now natural resource such as oil, but maybe with oil hitting negative prices, it may be something different as well in the future. And what I'm leading towards is what I read in your book, The Basic Income Guarantee. And the basic income guarantee, ensuring progress and prosperity in the 21st century. And I believe it was based on the example of Ireland.
Yes.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more in detail about your work, maybe from drawing from the book, but also your work with Ireland. You already mentioned this, but maybe expand it a little bit more, especially in the context of SDGs, right? The Sustainable Development Goals of the UN.
Yeah, so I started working with a group, which was the Social Justice Commission of the CORI, which was the umbrella group for all the religious orders in Ireland back then in 95. And I taught in Ireland in 94, 95 at University College Cork. And now this has spun off into Social Justice Ireland. And so Social Justice Ireland, I think, has been, like, if not the most, one of the most effective sort of NGOs and influence in public policy in the country. And so basic income has been one thing. We've worked on many things, including we created this index of social progress for Ireland, or now it's the index of sustainable progress using the SDGs. But the Irish situation right now, they have no one in the last election, no one won enough of a support so that you need at least 3 parties in order to get a new government. So they're all negotiating right now. And many of the parties have a commitment to substantially funding investigating basic income, because basic income is a big part of their platform. And so it's been since late 90s something that has been debated by all the public parties, all the big major parties in Ireland, and would have had a good shot at success if it wasn't for the euro. Because in the 90s, we had all the politicians engaging it, and then everything shut down as they went into the euro. And they said, well, we really can't think of anything or consider anything until we see how does this euro experiment work, et cetera. And then they got distracted by the property boom and then the recession and all that. But so now it's coming back, and a lot of the political parties have been pushing it before the pandemic, but now it's being supported even more when you have mass unemployment and dislocation because of the pandemic. So it will certainly be part of the political debate in Ireland. At least one of the parties in government will have, as part of the manifesto, a commitment to a basic income.
So what I know is that you've also been kind of contributing, and in fact, I think instrumental in connection with Ireland is the Sustainable Progress Index, the work around that.
Well,
could you talk a little bit more about what that is?
Well, that is, again, this was work that I originally did in 95, 96 for them. And it was critiquing the government in Ireland had developed a economic growth over everything policy, so that as long as GDP was going up, that's all that mattered. And so the economy went through this called the Celtic Tiger, this massive increase, growth rates of 6, 7, 8% for many years. The government ran budget deficits for 15 years. And yet it took a very long time, 12 years into this boom economy, before you started to see the benefits trickle down to average workers. And of course, you had a couple of years of that, and then everything blew up. And so what we have been arguing is that GDP is an important tool for economists to do their analysis and make some policies, but the government has to look at social well-being in a broad way so they can evaluate how their policies are actually affecting children and families and the disabled and all sorts of groups. So, I mean, we did it well before there were any SDGs, but then when the SDGs came out, then you had not only a framework, but you had commitment by particularly all the European Union countries to track the 230 some Sustainable Development Goal indicators. So now that you have this wealth of data that you could use, and what we always did is we compared Ireland with 14 other countries in the European, in the Eurozone, so that you can benchmark how is Ireland doing in terms of the environment, how are they doing in terms of youth. So like one issue is NEET, which is youth who are not in education, training, or employment. During the recession in Ireland, it went up to 20%. But many countries in Europe, it stayed flat at 4 or 5%. You know, so the idea is that you can point to the government and say, look at how the Netherlands has been able to keep their youth engaged. We should look at their policies as maybe ways that we could do the same thing, because it's very important for youth to be engaged. You don't want them not in education and not in employment, not in training. That causes long-term problems. So, I mean, it's a very business school approach, which the SDGs is basically designed by business school professors, it seems like, that will just come up with a lot of benchmarks and measure the heck out of everything, and then and that's useful. I mean, it's not everything, because you still need a sense of values and vision and what connects people as people, but it's all designed to counter this whole GDP is all that matters. You know, in 2015, Ireland's GDP went up 25.6%. Now, that's impossible, but but it did. And
all about how you count.
Yeah, but so it's it's there's a growing consensus now among many economists that GDP is just not a good indicator for how your country's doing, and the SDGs give us a huge array of variables that we can look at, that we can assess how countries are doing, so that you can measure and say this policy isn't working. Look, infant mortality is going up. We need to do something different.
Well, I agree with you on this one, and I see there's so much new research that is coming out tackling GDP with sort of titles beyond GDP or alternatives to GDP. And of course, UN has had the HDI, the Human Development Index, for quite a while, and so on. But kind of drawing towards the conclusion, because I know we've already been talking for quite a while, I have, I think, just two more questions. One is very important, I believe, and probably will help the audience understand also sort of your intellectual background into the topic of basic income, SDGs as well. I was curious if you could kind of share a little bit more details on the concept of Catholic social thought and how it influences your work. What are sort of some of the key facts that people should really know about it to understand why it is important, how it connects with sort of today in general?
Okay, well, the Catholic social thought tradition starts in the 1890s, maybe a little earlier, but it's basically, it was looking at the Industrial Revolution and how is it so upended the lives of people of the working class for the most part, and that they were just being excluded, and that we needed to think about how you can improve their lives in a different way, and not in terms of coming up with policies. I mean, John Paul II would always say it's the church's it's not the church's job to come up with economic policies. That's not our expertise. But what they centered on back then, and this has been the central theme since then, is that the sort of laissez-faire capitalism just reduced humans to just this rational economic men in a dog-eat-dog world, and just took them out of community, emptied them of any sort of humanity. And what Catholic social thought emphasizes that all people are born with inherent dignity. They have a social nature. They're unique individuals, but they have a social nature. They have to live in community. Participation is fundamental to being a human. And so starting from there, you start to ask different questions as to how should society solve its very economic and social problems. And it became the basis of much of what became the human rights literature, the work by Jacques Maritain in terms of the UN Declaration. It inspired the Human Development Index for the United Nations that came after. It was inspired by Pope Paul VI encyclical. And so it's just taking this view that if humans have dignity and if they are inherently social, how does that change how we try to understand problems right now for Pope Francis of the environment and climate change, and how we see it as much an ethical issue as a scientific issue, putting the dignity of the human person as an essential part. And of course, part of being human is being human on Earth. And our relationship with the planet is part of being human. And so it just frames it differently. It doesn't necessarily give an economic agenda. You could bring in economic concepts from different, you'd have a hard time bringing Austrian economics because they take this rational economic man to extremes.
I think it's slightly becoming less popular these days.
Yeah,
but
one could hope. But it's not an economic agenda. So when I work at the United Nations with the Holy See, we're not there to say this is the way you should solve problems. We're there to say that when in discussing this problem, we have to look at how does it affect the poor, because the preferential option for the poor is one of the fundamental concepts of Catholic social thought. So the first thing we look at, does this improve the lives of the poor? Because if it doesn't, then we need to move on to something else. If they're excluded from the central focus of the starting point of a policy, then we're on the wrong track. And so it's much more to engage the world, different countries, in the discussions on economic and social and political policy, but to reinforce that humans have dignity, promote human rights, education, healthcare, and all those, as well as be the institution that's always speaking out for the poor.
Yeah. So, and for full disclosure, I'd like to also acknowledge that I'm happy to and enjoy every time we get a chance to cooperate on working with the Holy See mission on these topics as observers, as experts, and contributing kind of our expertise, specifically focusing on these questions, development, and especially as it affects the poor, global poor, and it's a very serious issue. So I see where your also motivation for basic income as a kind of very pragmatic solution comes in. Incidentally,
in fact, Pope Francis mentioned basic income last week. That is, he suggested that this is something that we might have to start looking at because of the disruptions from the pandemic.
So that's going to be one of the questions I'm going to ask in a moment, but just a quick comment. For me, the initial motivation came from a very unlikely source, a German philosopher, Georg Wilhelm Hegel. Basically, in 1821, he wrote a short or long, rather, piece, Philosophy of Right, with 2 short paragraphs stating that the new society that was evolving at the time would be leading towards impoverishment of masses. And that needs to be resolved for the sole preservation of that new industrial society, new capitalist society. And he had two sources, either tax the rich or create a system of support. And at that time, of course, he referred to churches and these type of sort of communal organizations. Of course, today we have much more in terms of fiscal flexibility, but also organizations. So this is a topic that's been on policymakers' mind for a very long time, right? Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, right now we're asking the whole country to stay in their houses, or at least, 75%. The other 25% are essential workers going out. For some people, like college professors, it's not that great a sacrifice because we still have our paychecks. Whereas for many people, they've lost their livelihood. And this is just completely unfair that the benefits of the society should be shared with them, particularly since we all have to sacrifice, and we shouldn't have their sacrifice being so much greater than those of us who can work from home, etc. So in this situation, a basic income seems sort of obvious, but we just, since 1980, have gone through this transformation to a globalized economy, which has excluded the old working class and industrial belt from the benefits because they don't have the education. They're not in the urban centers on the coasts that have benefited from this new economy. No, you have to. There should be in the system as well and benefit. And a basic income is a way that recognizes there is going to be winners and losers anytime you make a change, and you can dramatically reduce the effects of those who are going to lose by ensuring that, yes, but you're still going to be supported. And we're going to support you so that you can train and try to get into a different path because your industry no longer is going to be around because it's either going overseas or it's just disappearing altogether. I mean, we have a lot of people who became very wealthy or middle class, good lives, working in fracking in the past 10 years. And if the situation stays like this for another couple of years, they'll all be unemployed, or another 6 months, they'll all be unemployed because there's just no demand for what they produce. It shouldn't be, the gains shouldn't be so concentrated and the losses so widely spread. It should be more equal.
You did mention at the beginning John Kenneth Galbraith and Milton Friedman, which we know are just at both end of the spectrum. So even though they don't see eye to eye on many issues, at least they agree on basic income. And lately, we've also seen a lot of support. You mentioned the Pope, but there is also, just recent news that I got today, a group of 100 United Kingdom members of parliament who came up in support of basic income. So an old idea is finally getting close to, being a policy. So do you think the crisis that we are going through right now is going to accelerate the process?
Well, it could, because an obvious thing that should be done is some form of universal support for the huge percentage of people who are being dislocated because of the pandemic, which probably is going to last up to 18 months. It's not going to go back to normal until there's a vaccine or an effective treatment, and these things do not happen very quickly. And if you start that system, it's hard to go back away from it. Once people have a benefit, they're not going to want to give it up. I mean, you have, if you introduce universal health care in America, you'll get people complaining for a couple months, maybe a couple years. But like Obamacare now, as soon as you start to try to take any of it away, then people start marching. And so once people get used to having a monthly check, they're going to see that, no, we want to keep this. And then even Republicans will come out in favor of it.
So very interesting, all fascinating. And we can continue talking about this much longer, especially your comment just a moment ago about how some of the jobs are disappearing. And in this, I hear the effects of automation on top of the other pressures that we're dealing with right now. But let's leave it for another time, for another meeting, probably.
Mhm.
I'd like to thank Ibrahima for joining us and on this panel, but most biggest thanks to Dr. Clark, Charles Clark of St. John's University, Tobin College of Business of St. John's University, and we are very grateful for you sharing your expertise with us today and your views on concept of basic income and in general, philosophical.
Thanks for having me.
Once again, I'd like to thank everyone for joining. I'd like to thank Ibrahima for working with us on this panel, and I'd like to thank Dr. Clark for sharing his expertise and his knowledge about all these topics, especially basic income and topics of economic philosophy. So this sums up today's edition of Smart Talk, and for more information on this and other episodes, please visit the Henry George School of Social Science website at henrygeorgeschool.org. I'm Aleksandr Gevorkyan, and thank you for joining us for this Smart Talk. Goodbye.